we're going to be playing around with the Skin Shader 4. So go ahead and select that and then go in here to the modifiers options. Now there's a lot of things you can do in here. We're going to kind of narrow it down to just what you would need to kind of get a stylized render, but we're going to talk about some of these options as we move along. Starting with this diffuse and this ambient. If you crank this diffuse up, you're going to see that color is going to change, and this will all change on the fly real time in the viewport as well. And if you crank that diffuse all the way up, that's going to allow as much of your poly paint or as much as your base color through as possible. Now the more you bring this down, the darker it's going to be. So you can kind of play with that setting to kind of dial in exactly the look you're going for. And again, if you want to, with the poly paint off, you can choose whatever color you want. I'm going to put that back up to white. Ambient's going to let more or less ambient light in, and you're going to see it's also going to update on your shader sphere down here, so you can kind of dial that in as well. I'm going to go ahead and leave that value about the same. Now, just like when we were talking about shadows and gradients, whenever you're doing a drawing and you're drawing in shadows and stuff, a lot of times things will just be filled in with a solid color. There won't be a lot of gradient work. So in order to get a cel-shaded look, what we're going to do is we're going to go into this diffuse curve here. So we're just going to click on this here. And you're going to see by default, this is the diffuse curve that ZBrush adds to the Skin Shader 4. So let's talk about the basic functionality of just how to manipulate this graph. If you click on this orange dot, you can move this orange dot up or down the graph. You can pull it away, you can push it in, and you're going to see as I do that, it's updating that sphere to give you a different look. So if you want to kind of blow out those highlights, you can pull this dot forward. If you want to make it all darker, you can pull it inwards. You're also going to see if I pull this way out, and I'm just looking at this curve right here. If you take this outside curve and you bring it in, that'll change the fall off. So if you go through here, you can actually change, you can change that fall off here. But what we're going to be doing is making very sharp transitions. You're going to see these are very gradual gradient transitions. So what I want to do is I want to grab this dot, I want to pull it off and still don't let go, but just hang on and then bring it back. And when you bring it back, you're going to see we're getting a very harsh transition. So now what we can do is we can kind of move this all the way over to the left, and already we're starting to get a very clean line right here. Now, in order to make more dots, all you got to do is just click on that graph and it'll make a new dot. Now, of course, this dot right here is going to have a fall off. So if you don't want that, just drag off and then drag back on. And now you're going to see we're going to get a very, very harsh transition on this graph. And then one more time, just drag off, drag back on, and pull up. And instead of a gradient along the shader ball, you can see you have very distinct values. And how that's being driven is this diffuse graph that we made right here. Now, of course, if you want to change this, all you got to do is click on these dots and move them over. So if you want to move these over here, we can. And always remember, this lighting direction is being controlled by our light. So we can go over here to the light. We can move this around and kind of see how that affects our object. Now, instead of going through here and grabbing these dots and moving them in to kind of dictate where these fall-offs happen, you can also go in here to the focal shift, and that'll push it over here to the left. And then push it over here, push it over here to the left, and then push over to the right, and you're going to see it's going to concentrate those values in more specific areas on your model. And just for more options, another way to get this kind of look, if you go down here and you hit this reset button, that's going to reset your line. So now again, we have all our gradients back in our diffuse. If you go over here to strength, and as we start cranking that up, you're going to see it's going to start creating a dividing line here. And as I do that, these values are going to become more contrasty. It's going to start banding. So you can see we can crank that strength up, and essentially we're getting kind of a Sin City look. It's either on or it's off. So you see it's off or it's on. And again, you can use this focal shift to push those white values to smaller areas of the object, or you can crank it over here and you can really just get those shadows nice and dark and leave the rest of it kind of blown out. So use that, again, use that focal shift. And now that we've moved that strength up, you're going to see if we have strength at 0, our steps is grayed out. However, if strength is at 1 or any value higher than 0, I should say, we have a steps option available to you. Now, if I crank the steps option, you're going to see it's going to start introducing more values. So it's adding kind of a posterization effect. Now, if you want to, you can see right here, this is actually adding gradation. So what I want to do, I'm going to go ahead and say the strength should be at 1. And then now as I add steps, it's going to give me a posterized look. You can see on the shader ball here. Now, sometimes what I would normally do is just bring a sphere in here so you can see a little bit better, but you know, there's a sphere right here right in your shader ball, so you're kind of seeing the effect of this on the fly. So you can add more posterization or less posterization just using that. So of course you go up here to BPR, now you have flat shadows. Your object just has a few values, so again, it's already getting that hand-drawn look. Let's go ahead and set this steps to 1. Let's go ahead and reset that. And speaking of posterization, I do want to bring in one more thing down here, and that's going to be under the mixer. Underneath the mixer here, you're going to see we actually have a posterize option. So even with all these gradients on here, you can actually crank this posterize up, and you can set a posterize value. So if you set it to 1, that's going to give you light and dark. 0 is just going to give you dark. If you set it to 2, that's going to give you light, dark, and gray, and 3 is going to give you more values. So now you're starting to pull in more whites, midtones, and then shadows. So as you crank this up, past a certain amount, it's just going to look like a gradient. But as you can see here, we can actually create a posterize effect just by using the mixer. But for now, let's go ahead and turn that down to 0. Go back up here, change our strength to 1, our steps to 2. Actually, change your steps to 3, and then I want to talk about one more option here, and you can see right here on the shader ball, there's still a gradient happening, and that's actually in the specular. If you take the specular value and you move it to 0, you're going to see it completely gets rid of it, so now we have a very flat looking model, and again, that's not necessarily a bad thing. If you're rendering things that aren't shiny, for example, you generally would want not a lot of spec, but for things that are drawn, or certainly for shiny things, having a specular is kind of nice. Now you can crank that specular up, and now you're going to see our specular is very, very white. And in fact, if you go down here, you're going to see our spec color is turned blue. So that's why you can see there's kind of a blue tint right here. If you change the specular color to anything else, you just click on that, and you can change it to, green or red. We'll go ahead and keep it blue for now. But if you want to have that color selected, but you don't want to see it, just change that color specular down to 0, and it won't affect it. But let's go ahead and keep that up to 100, just so we can see the effect it's having on our object. So to get rid of that gradient around our specular, let's say we do want to keep our specular, all you have to do is do the exact same thing we did for the diffuse for the specular. In fact, if you want to, you can go to this diffuse curve, and you can say copy, and then you can go to the specular curve, and you can say paste, and that'll go ahead and put your specular values the same as your diffuse. However, in this case, it didn't really work that well. And it's pretty easy to go ahead and set yourself. So I'm just going to hit reset. And then now if we click and drag, you're going to see it's going to give us kind of a shinier spec. It's going to contain that specular to smaller areas. And then this is a broader spec. In fact, just with specular, you can come down here and you can change it from a Fong to a Blinn if you want to. And incidentally, colorizing your spec can also be done with the diffuse, ambient, and cavity. Cavity we're going to get to in a second. Ambient, with that one selected, you can actually colorize your ambient. So if you take that ambient slider here and you crank that up, you're going to see we're starting to introduce red into here because we have red selected under ambient. But we'll go ahead and crank that back down, and we'll turn off colorize for ambient. So anyway, back to our specular curve. Again, if we want to simplify this, we can just hit reset. We can change our strength to 1. We can dial in however many steps we want, say 2 steps, or hell, even 1 step if you want to. Or if you want to do it manually, again, you can just click in here, drag out and drag back in, and you can set the specular to get whatever look you'd like to kind of emphasize that cell shaded look. And again, if that's too much specular, you can just dial that down a bit, or you can use that focal shift again to contain it to smaller areas of your model. So if I crank that all the way over here to the right, now our specular is only affecting right where that light falls. So we'll go ahead and hit BPR, and that's the look we're going to get. Or like I mentioned before, if you don't want any spec on here, you can just grab that specular and just drag it down to 0. And that's what we have. I'm going to go ahead and take this diffuse and go ahead and crank it up to 100. And I take these steps, and I'm just going to punch in 4. And now let's go back all the way down here, back down here to this mixer. So we talked about the posterize already, but now you're going to see there's an outline and a depth option. If we crank that outline up, we're going to get a real-time updated outline here. And you're going to see when I click and drag it, it takes a second for it to update. When we get to the BPR filters, if you hold down shift and drag, it'll update on the fly. But unfortunately with this one, that's not the case. You'll have to kind of just wait around. So you can crank up this outline, and of course, the higher the value, the darker the outline. And then if you put this down to 0, there actually is no outline. So actually you can get kind of a cool watercolor looking effect. But let's go ahead and crank this up so we can talk about depth. Now this depth option here, if you crank this depth up, you're going to see it's only going to capture kind of the outline of my object the higher this is. So we crank it up to 100. Let's go ahead and hit BPR. You're going to see it's just outlining kind of the outside edges of my object. If we take that depth and move it down, you're going to see it's going to start outlining all those internal edges. So kind of use this to kind of dial in exactly that outline look that you want. Hit BPR render, and now you have a nice cell shaded look, flat shadow with outline, real-time material driven cell shaded render. Now if you want to play around with some other settings, what you can do is you can hit the comma key, and we're skipping ahead a little bit here, but you can go over here to render set, and this is what we're going to get into next, which is the BPR filters. But like we mentioned before, underneath the project here, there was NPR projects that you can open that have materials already kind of set up for you. So if you want to take an object in there, one thing you can do, if you already have an object loaded, instead of loading a tool after you load the project, what you can do is you can copy this tool, and then you can go into this project NPR folder, and let's grab this cartoon render 02, and then say, no, you don't want to save changes. And then this is going to be their setup, and if you look here, we have modifiers. You can see the diffuse curve's already been set up for you. The specular curve has also already been set up for you. So everything we've already talked about has already been set up on this material, but we lost our tool that we were working with. But all you got to do now is you go up here and you can paste that tool. And we've essentially pasted this tool in with those material settings. And again, if we go all the way down here to the mixer, you can see the outline's already been set up for us and the depth's already been set up for us. So that's just one kind of easy way to take those material settings that they have and go ahead and use their rendering to apply it to your object. Now you're going to see we got some warbly lines. Again, that's getting ahead. That's getting to BPR filters. But I just wanted to show you how to copy and paste a tool into a new project. Oh, and one thing I said I was going to go over but didn't, this cavity option right here controls your outline color. So you can see underneath the mixer we have our outline, so we go ahead and crank that all the way up. We have a nice dark outline. Of course it's dark because we have cavity chosen as black. If you choose a white color, it's going to fill it with white, or you can choose anything in between. You can, if you don't want to go full black, you can do like maybe a dark gray, or if you want to even like have a little bit more of a stylized look, you can choose like a red or a dark red to kind of give you something a little bit more interesting for your outlines.